Have you ever felt like your D&D campaigns could use a little bit more spice? Something beyond just the usual dungeon crawling and like the typical monster slaying. We're talking about conflicts that could shake up your game world to its core. Conflicts with real lasting consequences that impact everyone and everything. That's what we're diving into today.
Okay, regional conflicts in D&D.
Yeah, regional conflicts, they can really inject a level of dynamism into your D&D campaigns that you just can't get from just a good versus evil story.
Right.
They introduce all these different elements like power struggles and scarcity of resources and ideological clashes can make the world feel truly alive.
Yeah, and in my last campaign, my character actually got swept up in this huge conflict between a noble house that was like completely obsessed with this ancient prophecy.
Wow.
And this rebel faction that was fueled by this really charismatic leader, but he had this like super secret hidden agenda. It made for some really tense moments because we were constantly trying to figure out like who to trust and what the real stakes were in all of this. That's a great example of how believable motivations can really elevate a regional conflict. Those motivations don't have to be simple or obvious. They can be layered and nuanced, and that'll keep your players guessing.
So how do we as dungeon masters go beyond just throwing two armies at each other and create conflicts that are both engaging and realistic?
Well, one key is to really think about the different factions involved and give them some goals that are relatable. So it could be something like a merchant guild that wants to monopolize a vital trade route, or maybe it's a group of druids who are fighting to protect a sacred grove, or even like a secret society that's manipulating everything from the shadows.
Right. And those factions should exist in a dynamic world.
Yeah.
A world that reacts to player choices, right?
Absolutely. The decisions that the players make should have consequences. So, for example, if they side with a rebellion, that could lead to increased taxes or martial law in certain regions. Or if they manage to broker some kind of peace treaty, it might be really fragile and prone to collapse if certain conditions aren't met.
So what are some practical ways to weave those consequences into the gameplay? How can we make the world feel responsive to player actions?
Well, one thing you can do is have NPCs react to player decisions in future encounters. So, if the players helped a particular village, maybe the next time they visit, they get a really warm welcome and some valuable information. But conversely, if they cause a lot of destruction, they might face hostility or find that the village has been abandoned.
I really like the idea of the world remembering player choices. It creates a sense of continuity and makes those choices feel more meaningful.
Exactly. You can also tie quests directly to the regional conflict. So instead of just sending players in a fetch quest for a magical item, have them uncover a conspiracy that could shift the balance of power, or maybe they have to negotiate a trade agreement that could alleviate a famine, or even participate in a key battle that determines the fate of a territory.
Those quests sound a lot more engaging than just clearing out a dungeon. They give players a sense of purpose and make them feel like active participants in the conflict.
Right, and remember, those quests don't always have to involve combat. Players can use their skills in diplomacy, persuasion, even deception to achieve their objectives. So that makes each character feel valuable, regardless of their class.
Speaking of different approaches, how do we incorporate things like magic or cultural norms into these conflicts? How can we add more depth and complexity?
Well, think about how magic might influence the conflict. Perhaps one side possesses a powerful artifact that gives them an edge in battle, or maybe there's a prophecy that foretells the destruction of a city unless certain conditions are met. These elements can add a layer of unpredictability and make the world feel more fantastical.
So we're not just talking about wizards casting fireballs here. Magic can be woven into the fabric of the conflict and drive the narrative in unexpected directions.
Exactly, and don't forget about societal dynamics. Imagine a conflict where players have to navigate a complex caste system or adhere to strict cultural taboos to achieve their goals. These elements can add a layer of realism and challenge players to think outside the box.
Like, for example, imagine players trying to negotiate a treaty in a society where certain gestures are considered, deeply offensive, or where women are forbidden from speaking directly to men in positions of authority. That can make for some very interesting role-playing opportunities.
Absolutely. And these societal elements can also be used to create internal conflicts within factions. Maybe a noble house is divided over whether to embrace progressive reforms or cling to tradition. Or perhaps a religious order is split between those who preach pacifism and those who believe in holy war.
So it's not just about conflict between different groups, it's also about conflict within those groups. And those internal struggles can provide great opportunities for players to get involved, perhaps by choosing sides or trying to mediate a resolution.
Exactly. And remember, the goal isn't necessarily to have players solve these internal conflicts, but rather to have those conflicts inform their decisions and actions, adding depth and complexity to the overall narrative.
Okay, so we've established that regional conflicts can make D&D campaigns much more dynamic and engaging. But it all sounds pretty complex. How do we keep track of all these moving parts, these factions and their motivations, and the potential consequences of player actions?
It's definitely a challenge, but there are tools and techniques that can help. Personally, I like to use mind maps to visualize the different factions and their relationships to each other and their goals. This helps me keep track of who's allied with whom, who's likely to betray whom, and how different events might impact the overall balance of power.
So it's like creating a web of interconnected elements, where tugging on one thread can have repercussions throughout the entire web.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is that you don't have to plan everything out in advance. You can let the conflict evolve organically, reacting to player choices and introducing new elements as the story unfolds.
That sounds like a great way to keep things fresh and unpredictable, both for you as the Dungeon Master and for your players.
It also encourages collaboration. Instead of just presenting players with a predetermined story, you're inviting them to help shape that story through their choices and actions.
I love that approach. It turns D&D into a true partnership between the Dungeon Master and the players, where everyone is contributing to the creation of something unique and memorable.
And when you have that kind of collaborative energy at the table, that's when the real magic happens.
So we've laid the groundwork for understanding what regional conflicts are and why they're so beneficial for D&D campaigns. But how do we actually put these concepts into practice? How do we go from a vague idea to a fully realized conflict that will keep our players engaged for sessions to come?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll delve into deeper in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore how to design compelling quests that tie into the conflict, how to resolve or escalate those conflicts in satisfying ways, and how to incorporate elements of surprise and unpredictability to keep your players on their toes.
Sounds like we have a lot more ground to cover. I'm already eager to hear more.
Me too. This is where the real fun begins.
So before we took that pause, we were talking about all those intricate webs of alliances and betrayals. But what happens when those webs start to unravel? How do we, as Dungeon Masters, bring a regional conflict to a conclusion that actually feels satisfying?
Well, resolving a regional conflict in D&D, it's not just about declaring a winner and a loser.
Right.
It's more about creating a conclusion that feels organic, like a natural consequence of everything that has happened before it.
Okay, so we're aiming for something a little bit more nuanced than just like a standard peace treaty.
Exactly, yeah. A treaty might be signed, but what if it's riddled with loopholes and secret clauses, or even just plain resentment? That could set the stage for simmering tensions and potential future conflicts. And that gives you all these narrative threads that you can pick up later on.
So it's almost like planting seeds for future adventures, right? The immediate conflict might be resolved, but those ramifications just keep rippling outward, impacting the world and its inhabitants.
Right. Think about the societal shifts that could occur. Maybe you have two nations that were forced to cooperate against a common enemy, and they discover all these shared values, and eventually they merge into a new society. Or maybe the conflict leads to the rise of some charismatic leader who unites all these different factions under their banner, and they completely reshape the political landscape.
Those are some really great examples of how a conflict's resolution can create lasting change in the world. It's not just about ending the fighting, it's about exploring those long-term consequences and how they shape the world going forward.
Right. And don't underestimate the power of unpredictable events.
Yeah.
So something like a natural disaster or a divine intervention or even the discovery of a long-lost artifact. These things could dramatically alter the course of the conflict and force everyone to adapt and reevaluate their priorities.
It's almost a reminder that even in this world of magic and monsters, sometimes forces beyond anyone's control can intervene and add this element of chaos and realism to the story.
Absolutely. And now imagine flipping the script entirely.
Okay.
What if, instead of resolving the conflict, you chose to escalate it?
Oh.
Just as things seem to be winding down, this new threat emerges, something that just dwarfs the original conflict.
Wow.
And it forces everyone to band together for survival.
That's a great way to raise the stakes and introduce a whole new level of challenge for the players.
Yeah.
Suddenly, all those old rivalries might seem insignificant compared to this new danger, and You could have all these unexpected alliances and shifting power dynamics.
Exactly. It's all about keeping your players guessing, reminding them that the world is dynamic and constantly evolving. Their choices might have resolved one conflict, but in doing so, they may have inadvertently created another one that's even more dangerous.
So speaking of keeping players engaged, you mentioned earlier drawing inspiration from resources like LitRPG Reads. What specifically have you found helpful in their content?
LitRPG Reads has so many articles and guides on creating immersive D&D experiences, and they really focus on things like world building and narrative design. They offer practical advice on pretty much everything, from crafting believable factions to designing quests that tie into larger conflicts.
I've also found their articles to be incredibly valuable, especially when I'm looking for new ideas or I'm trying to tackle a specific challenge in my campaign.
Yeah, and another source of inspiration for me has been the work of Paul Bello. He's a game designer who's known for his innovative approaches to player agency and dynamic storytelling. His ideas have really pushed me to think outside the box when I'm designing conflicts that feel meaningful and unpredictable.
His work sounds fascinating. I'll definitely have to check it out.
You should.
So as we kind of wrap up this section on resolving conflicts, is there any final wisdom you'd like to share? Any key takeaways for our listeners?
I would say just remember that regional conflicts are ultimately about people. Their motivations, their relationships, and how those things are affected by the events that are unfolding around them.
So it's really about creating a story that feels human and relatable, even within this, fantastical setting.
Yeah. Focus on those believable factions with clear goals, make sure the stakes are high, and that the consequences of player choices are tangible. And above all, embrace the unexpected, allow the conflict to evolve organically, and I think you'll create a really captivating experience for your players.
Great advice. We've covered so much in this deep dive about regional conflicts in D&D.
Yeah, from the core elements that make these conflicts so engaging to the more practical tips for incorporating them into your campaigns.
Yeah, we've talked about designing believable factions, crafting those quests that tie into that larger narrative, and resolving those conflicts in a way that feels both satisfying and organic.
And we've also touched on the importance of player agency, ensuring that the choices players make have real and lasting consequences in the game world.
Absolutely. And when I think back on my own D&D experiences, I can definitely see how much regional conflicts have just enriched my enjoyment of the game.
For sure. They take D&D beyond those simple dungeon crawls and monster encounters and transform it into this truly immersive storytelling experience.
It's no longer just about defeating the next enemy or acquiring that next magic item.
Right. It becomes about shaping the very fabric of the world itself, influencing the destinies of nations and entire cultures.
And for players, it's a chance to really embody their characters, making decisions that truly matter, and witnessing those ripple effects of their decisions throughout the game world.
It's about feeling like an active participant in this grand narrative, a story where their actions have the power to change the course of history.
That sense of agency and impact is what makes D&D so captivating, and regional conflicts provide such a fantastic framework for fostering that kind of engagement.
They offer a canvas for collaborative storytelling, where the dungeon master and the players work together to create something truly unique and memorable.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, I want to encourage all of our listeners to embrace the potential of regional conflicts in their own D&D campaigns.
Yeah, don't be afraid to think big, to introduce these really complex political landscapes, weave in those societal dynamics and mystical elements, and let your players' choices shape the unfolding narrative.
Because when you do that, you create a world that feels alive, a world where anything is possible and every adventure is a step into the unknown.
And before we go, I just want to give another shout out to LitRPG Reads and Paul Bello for their really inspiring work in the realm of D&D and dynamic storytelling.
Their insights have been so valuable to us, and we highly recommend exploring their work if you're looking to level up your own campaigns.
And as always, we'd love to hear from you, our amazing listeners.
So please share your thoughts on regional conflicts in the comments below.
Tell us about your experiences, your challenges, your triumphs, and any tips that you have for fellow dungeon masters.
Let's keep this conversation going and continue to inspire each other to create truly unforgettable D&D experiences.
Until next time, happy gaming!